Welcome back to the Beyond Phenomenal podcast. My name is Bryce Bicknell, and it's been a couple weeks since I posted my last episode, and that's because I'm still waiting for all the dust to settle from this UFO balloon, Chinese balloon, and UAP shoot-down fiasco. With that said, though, not much has come out of it, and I want to just cover everything that we know so far and not waste any of your guys' time, so I'll get into the main sort of story that I really am interested in now that kind of underpins a lot of the stuff going on behind the scenes with the Chinese balloon and other UAP shoot-downs. So two journalists, Ross Coulthart and Christopher Sharp, claim to have sources that tell them there's a division in the government, particularly between the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Air Force. The Navy may have come to the White House with information that the Air Force has not been fully transparent with the president and other parts of the government on UAP. So they both vouch for the idea that there's a new interagency task force, which was announced by the White House, I think on Twitter and through some press releases, that this task force is in response to the information that was given by the Navy and other parties. And Ross Coulthart specifically indicated that the Air Force may have acted illegally regarding this issue. And that was in a new episode of Need to Know that Ross Coulthart does with his co-host, Bryce Zabel. And Bryce also has... Funny enough, yeah, we have the same name. But Bryce Zabel, posted on a Medium article detailing the history between the Air Force and the Navy on UFOs and kind of what the Air Force may know and their sensor systems. We've talked about this in the past, so I'm just going to link it in the description, and you can check it out if you want some context. But we know that the Air Force has taken this very seriously from members of the Air Force who have come out and said that, even if publicly, they haven't been so forthcoming. I mean, they were the people behind Project Blue Book, as well as Project Sign and Project Grudge. So historically, they do know about this topic. But I'll read from the article posted on Liberation Times. That was from Christopher Sharp, that talks about this whole new interagency task force and potentially what could be what could be this hidden information that was uncovered by the Navy about the Air Force. So, quote, adding an extra layer to this story, sources have told Liberation Times that information relating to physics-defying UAP is being hidden from both Congress and President Joe Biden. Sources have spoken to Liberation Times and claimed that a senior commander within the United States Navy has informed President Joe Biden of a UAP cover-up, which is damning of the United States Air Force, a claim first made by Australian journalist Ross Coulthart. Commenting on the general situation regarding UAP transparency, Jeremy Corbell told Liberation Times that the floodgates are now opening and the ball is now in the Department of Defense's court. So that's pretty interesting. And to wrap this up into the whole balloon and UAP shoot-down thing, the Pentagon recently announced that it has no plans to release any of the footage from these three shoot-downs. And that came from an article posted on The Debrief by Tim McMillan. So it's in terms of the public, it's like, oh, we've shot these things down, and we think the intelligence community is saying that they're most likely research balloons or, private, kind of like hobbyist balloons or some kind of private entity that's not a state actor. And then, of course, the public and members of Congress. I mean, maybe members of Congress have seen seen the footage, but people want to see it, and the Pentagon says, well, we don't know. We don't know if we're ever going to tell you. And it just kind of flies in the face of any transparency that we're hoping to get. And that's really all we know so far. We've heard a lot of conflicting statements from members of Congress and the White House and NORAD and just every agency, it seems, or party has a different takeaway on this. And there's still no clear consensus. But I wanted to talk about this after what Christopher Sharp and Ross Coulthart are saying, because it gives an idea about, well, maybe there's something more going on behind the scenes. I believe Gary Nolan was also posting a photo of like some dam breaking on Twitter with the idea going along with what Jeremy Corbell was saying, that the floodgates are now kind of opening. And I'll just stick to what we know, and what we know is not a lot. What we do know is that Robert Salas, who is a former U.S. Air Force officer, gave evidence and information regarding his 1967 Malmstrom Air Force Base UFO incident to AARO, which is a second UAP office, different from the interagency task force that we talked about before, kind of an interesting thing that there's two now and speaks to some of the division on this subject. But he gave evidence to them through the official channels, as well as, I believe, another Air Force officer whose name was Robert Jacobs, who presented evidence in a 1964 Vandenberg UFO encounter. And this is really interesting because it shows that the reporting mechanism is working for AARO specifically. And it's just really good news to hear that stuff is happening behind the scenes, at least on one level. You can get into the lower level of maybe, something real big is happening, but at the very least, we do know that UFO evidence is getting to the right place, and we're getting a better historical narrative about what's going on in terms of what AARO is doing, and hopefully now this interagency task force will also get up to speed on. So that was really encouraging to hear. Moving on to the next story I wanted to talk about was some work done by John Greenwald at the Black Vault. He found in a FOIA request, he looked for keywords UFO, UAP, ATIP, and OSAP. He did a FOIA request in the Obama's presidential library and found that there were over 5,000 classified electronic documents related to those keywords. And ATIP and OSAP, of course, are those programs that were famously written about in the New York Times article from 2017 that detail the kind of secret UFO programs that were going on at the time. And Leslie Kean was one of the contributing authors for that New York Times piece. And she also has a new docuseries out produced through National Geographic. That's fantastic. I've been keeping up with it. It's on Hulu. And I recommend anyone who wants to kind of get up to speed on what's going on at kind of a high level, just check that out if you want to point it to any friends or family who are like, well, what's going on here? Yeah, so that's pretty much it. It seems interesting. I know the Black Vault, John also posted in a follow-up that it will take, I want to say 12 years is what the office said that it would take to go through all of these documents, which is absolutely ludicrous. There are probably only about 20 FOIA requests in front of him, and so 12 years is just absurd. It really speaks to the overall problem that you'll see in other headlines about overclassification or the just problem with secrecy in general with the U.S. government. And moving on, Project Unity, we had some updates. Jay spoke. Jay is the guy who runs Project Unity. He spoke with Oak Shannon once again, and Oak gave some additional context on how he met Admiral Wilson while in the Navy. They basically met through these massive parties that Oak and other, I think some of his other friends would throw. They would rent out a massive mansion nearby the Navy Academy, and I guess hundreds of people would show up. And yeah, for reference, Oak Shannon is referenced in the Eric Davis Admiral Wilson notes, the ones that famously are in the congressional record now. And potentially, if I wanted to speculate a little bit, you could say from what we learned about earlier, the United States senior commander in the U.S. Navy informing Joe Biden about like a cover-up, potentially, you never know. Wilson could have had some role to play in this behind the scenes, but we don't really know. We can only have, some guesses now, but hopefully there's some real movement that'll come out of this. And it's just good to know the context about, well, okay, so Oak really did know Wilson, even though Wilson is required to deny everything about that meeting and the core secrets of the alien programs, basically. But Oak said he was also contacted by members of Congress who inquired about his connection to the Advanced Theoretical Physics Working Group, which was a famous but informal group that's attempting to get access to those core programs that I was just talking about that have alien technology and, are studying related phenomena. And it's shortened to ATP, Advanced Theoretical Physics. The ATP group was a big player in terms of what the public was learning about all of these alien reverse engineering programs, and basically a source of a lot of the information that we get exposed to, because they were also, not bound by the same NDAs of these core programs, but they were, civilians and maybe members of former military members that were trying to get into this and, trying to develop a need to know to get read in. And that's just a little bit of context. If you really want to go deep into the weeds of the ATP working group, read Loose Threads. It's an online paper for free written by the Hermetic Penetrator and Omega Point that will give you the grueling detail about what's known about that program. And there's still, or that project, I should say. It's kind of like, is an informal project for for people who are really curious to try and get access and figure out what's going on. But Oak Shannon was also asked about remote viewing by these members of Congress, which is also a critical tool used by the ATP group. And it's worth its own podcast talking about remote viewing, but I'll kind of cover some highlights. Dr. Hal Puthoff was another member of the ATP group, and I'd recommend looking into his history. He ran a program, I think, through the CIA at the Stanford Research Institute in the 70s. So if you want to try and find interviews with him, that's Hal, H-A-L, Puthoff. So Hal Puthoff. You could also look into Ingo Swann and Albert Stubblebine III. These people are kind of tied up in the whole remote viewing scene. And remote viewing is an integral part of the UFO story because it's been used historically as a tool to glean information about UFOs because it can be so difficult. They're so elusive that you can't necessarily just, unless you have a craft, you can't just, pick it apart and touch it and work with it. You might have to try and use other strange extrasensory perception tools. And if you are skeptical about that, that's okay. My own personal experiences with remote viewing have been interesting. You can try it out yourself with some apps, or just look on the subreddit and there's some fun things that you can try. But really, I just keep an open mind about this stuff because it is a part of the story, and it's not going anywhere because it fits in the same strange category where it's not mainstream science and it's just kind of paranormal in general. But remote viewers were used, and most famously, I think, in the Iran hostage crisis, perhaps informally, but you can find a New York Post article on this, and I thought it was really interesting. One of the famous remote viewers was able to identify that they were about to release a hostage, and that his name was found in the deck of a playing card, in a deck of playing cards, and that he had multiple sclerosis. And ultimately, that did come out to be true. There's a guy named Richard Queens who came out and they released him because he was in critical condition and he did have multiple sclerosis. So, you can use this. You might say, "Wow, well, how did that happen?" Assuming that okay, let's just take it for granted for the moment that is exactly what happened. Well, how does it work? It taps into, I guess, this idea that everything is connected non-locally. And so you can get information consciously without regard to physical distance or time even. So, if you're skeptical about it, I recommend just trying it yourself for fun. And then also look at some of the history, look at some of the players and see, wow, well, we did give it a try. There are some documents from the CIA, I think from Project Stargate, that they are public now. They've been declassified. And they say that while it isn't accurate enough to become mainstream science, I think they did find that it defied statistical chance, that there wasn't something just totally random about it. There was enough to it that it kind of is in between, mainstream, I guess, I don't know how you say studyability. You can't necessarily study it scientifically perfectly, but there is something odd going on. And that's what I mean about the weird no man's land of UFOs and remote viewing. So anyway, that's mostly all I was trying to talk about this week. There's no big picture discussion that I really have, but I wanted to highlight that there could be some real developments going on behind the scenes that we don't know about in the U.S. government and the military. It seems that many members of Congress are upset over the obfuscation and the unjustified secrecy by the Pentagon and the Department of Defense with specific regard to the shoot downs. But as the deeper down the rabbit hole, it seems that there may be something more going down. And that's all I wanted to say for this week. Please stay tuned. I'm happy to see that people are watching this, and hopefully you guys, if you have any feedback, let me know. I'm keeping this one extra brief. I want to stay true to my goal of just giving you the facts. And with that said, have a good rest of your week, and I'll hopefully see you next week if there's some real good developments. So take care.